All right. Welcome to the Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce one of our own, Dr. Travis Rieder, who is a bioethicist and moral philosopher here at the Berman Institute, where he also directs our Masters of Bioethics degree program. While he's written on a wide variety of topics, the majority of his scholarship, speaking and writing for the public, falls into one of two research programs. The first involves the ethical and policy issues raised by pain medicine, opioids, other drugs, addiction, and North America's drug overdose crisis. His own entry into this topic was personal after a motorcycle accident in 2015. Led to an injury, an extended series of surgeries. This experience with opioids and the difficulty coming off them launched his interest in the topic and eventually became the subject of his TED Talk in his first book, the title of which was In Pain. Travis's most enduring research interest, however, has involved the overarching theme of, quote, catastrophe. He's a happy, fun guy. In particular, he's concerned with how to engage in ethical reasoning about our own individual lives in a time dominated by massive structural threats that are too big and too complex for any one of us to meaningfully address on our own. This has led to many publications on climate change, pandemics, food ethics, and even overpopulation, and is the subject of his second book, which has just come out, entitled Catastrophe Ethics. Travis.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews, for that very kind introduction. All right, this is really fun. It's really nice to get a chance to talk to, a friendly crowd, I presume. I'm gonna do like a whirlwind 40,000-foot overview of the arguments in the new book. That means I'm gonna have to leave a lot of things out. There's gonna be like a summary of the logic, and then I want to spend the most time giving you the sort of payoff at the end. And so that's what we're gonna spend our time talking about. And then the goal will be to leave 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Turns out people tend to have questions about this sort of thing. So that's what we're gonna do. Oh, I have to say, got it. Allison told me to do this and then I immediately forgot. Got it. And then back to slides. Yeah, okay, thank you. All right, I've now done this talk a couple of times, or versions of this talk, since the book came out. And the first thing I want to talk about is milk. And I've been told that this immediately makes me sound like Chidi from The Good Place. But this is a true story. It predates Chidi, predates Michael Schur's characters. And, I'm from Indiana, grew up drinking cow milk. And as I started to get into ethics and started thinking maybe I had to be concerned about what I eat, especially for environmental and animal welfare reasons, I decided I should not use animal-sourced milks. And so I tried soy milk, didn't particularly agree with me. I was really excited when almond milk came out, switched to almond milk. Family was largely using almond milk, some of them more and less happy about it than others. And then I started doing work with some colleagues here at the Berman Institute, where I found out that to produce a single almond takes about 12 liters of water. And almost all of the almonds in the world are grown in California during drought. So this is not great. Like, you trade off a more extensive carbon footprint of, say, cow milk for a very, very high water footprint for almond milk. So then I tried oat milk and it's disgusting. And now I just feel guilty about anything that I drink. This same sort of reasoning applies to lots of aspects of our life. So I drive an electric car. Some of you know about it because I love electric cars. I've been sort of an early adopter and an advocate of electric cars for a long time. I do this because every single climate model that has us with any real chance of avoiding serious catastrophe says there has to be basically a unilateral move to adopting electric vehicles. So we have to abandon internal combustion engines. And so my thought was, when I'm buying a new car, there's no reason that I should buy an ICE engine vehicle. But it's more expensive. It's quite a bit more expensive now. The technology is finally coming down. So there were real opportunity costs to this. I spent, I don't know, call it $10,000 more to have the electric car that I wanted that fit our family than I would have for, a similar sort of ICE car. So that's $10,000 I could have done a lot of other things with. That gets ramped up even more when it comes to solar panels, something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Like, oh, should I try to capture some energy from the sun so that when I'm powering my electric car, I'm not actually just using the dirty energy that comes from our electric grid, which is still by and large natural gas in Maryland. But now we're talking real expensive. So I finally last year did all of the getting quotes process. And to get 100% of our energy needs in Maryland for the size of our house and the fact that we charge 2 electric cars would cost over $60,000. Now we're talking serious opportunity costs. So here's a reasonable thing that somebody might say to an ethicist who's trying to make a change for ethical reasons. Hey, I want to get clean energy, so I'm going to spend all this money on solar panels. You know what else is really good to do? Like, I don't know, saving people from malaria, giving some of the poorest people in the world resources that they don't have. And you could do that with $65,000, right? Real moral trade-offs here. Already started talking about diet when we talked about milk, but I have had ever-changing moral heuristics for my diet in my adult life. I've been vegetarian. I've never been fully vegan. I've tried it, and it's, man, I salute all of you who are vegans. It's very hard. Been flexitarian. I've been vegetarian with the Cyprus cutout. My wife's from Cyprus, and it's very hard to be vegetarian there. So we can do all of that. And of course, very often when I'm giving talks like this, somebody has flown me to give that talk. So it seems rather important to ask things like, should we be flying, right? One thing to note about all of this is I feel varying levels of moral responsibility to address these sorts of actions, especially as I have more opportunities to do so. I feel various levels of guilt when I do things like fly, when I don't have to. But it's not going to make a real difference, right? We're going to talk more about this, but the most expensive thing that I do on a regular basis is fly to Cyprus with my family. That flight takes about a metric ton of CO2, or causes the emissions of about a metric ton of CO2. And what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change is trillions of tons of CO2. So this can start to feel a little precious, which I take it is why Chidi gets made fun of in the show, right? Also, if you take this seriously, that we have moral responsibility to reduce our carbon footprints, then I did something really significant that increased my carbon footprint. I made one of these. Luckily, she's super cute, but real costly to the environment. Now she's going to have her own carbon footprint. She's going to make more people who have their own carbon footprints. And I bet a bunch of people in this room have also done this. So we've really increased our carbon footprints, right? So this idea that when you're contemplating an action that is going to contribute to a massive structural threat, like say climate change, the idea that you should then withdraw your support, you should withdraw your participation, this appeals to what I call a purity ethic. And the language of purity ethic I take from Alexis Shotwell, although she's using a little bit of a different context. But the idea here is that the proper moral response to being implicated in a harm or an injustice is to get out of it, right? But when you start to feel like, oh, it's a little bit precious, it's also really hard and demanding and unreasonable. Like, think about all of these things. Having my kid was like one of the biggest things that increased my carbon footprint. It feels really unreasonable to say I shouldn't have had a kid. So you start to go that way. And then very quickly, when I have this conversation with other people, they start to lose their purity ethic pull. And they're like, you know what, you're right. Nothing matters. Nihilism. Nothing we do matters. Like, what percentage of all of the world's emissions are coming from the top 100 companies? Something like 70%, right? Like that my tiny little action is an absolute drop in the bucket. Nothing matters. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die, right? This is what I call the puzzle. The puzzle of individual moral responsibility or individual action in a time of massive collective threats, where it's the structural feature of that collective threat that makes it so very hard for our individual actions to make a significant difference. That's what my whole book is about, the puzzle. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you a quick roadmap, because I think Ruth Faden was the one who told me you always better have a roadmap when you give a talk. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the problem of causal inefficacy, which is the fancy language that philosophers use to describe that problem, that it doesn't seem like I can have a meaningful causal impact on whatever harm I'm worried about. And then I'm going to argue that's not just climate change. Climate change gives us maybe the purest example, but the puzzle arises everywhere, and it makes the sort of ethics that I want to do really way more important for navigating our lives, because we face this stuff all the time. And then I'm going to explain to you why philosophers think that traditional moral philosophy can't solve the puzzle, at least some philosophers. So I'm going to give you the like 90-second version of moral theory that says, you know what, none of these classic moral theories are going to solve this problem for us. And so that drives me to look towards less traditional moral philosophy to see if we can come up with an answer. There's going to be a little philosophy in this. If you were coming here hoping for a public health talk, hopefully an upshot. There's going to be a little moral philosophy here. And then eventually, I hope that this helps us to solve the puzzle. All right, so let's get going. Problem of causal inefficacy. This very handsome fellow right here is Walter Sennett Armstrong, a really fantastic philosopher down at UNC Chapel Hill. And back in 2005, he published a paper that has become sort of classic in this field. And the main title of the paper is "It's Not My Fault." And it's about individual responsibility in the era of climate change. And basically, he says, imagine that you want to go for a joyride in a super inefficient vehicle. He doesn't name the energy inefficient vehicle, but I assume it's this one, because this is like the dumbest vehicle humans have ever created, right? So you really like taking joyrides in your super energy inefficient vehicle, gives you a very slight hedonic boost, but nothing else going for it. Do you have a duty not to do this? Do you have a strict moral obligation not to, as it comes to be known, joy guzzle? All right. And Sennett Armstrong says, I think the answer sounds like it should be yes. I feel like the answer should be yes. That's my intuition. A lot of my colleagues have that intuition. I don't think we can actually justify that intuition. I think when you go do the moral work, you can't actually give an argument for why you are obligated not to joy guzzle. And this is a slight updating of his argument, but the basic idea is the scale and the complexity of the carbon cycle and the climate system are so incredibly vast that it just stretches plausibility to say that any single individual action, especially one as small as a joy guzzle, could actually have a causal impact in a way that contributes to harm. So this is like just a high school, college textbook of the carbon system or the carbon cycle. And the basic idea here is that when you emit a little bit of carbon, so if you joy guzzle in one of these super efficient vehicles, Armstrong estimates that you emit 14 kilograms of CO2. So it goes up into the atmosphere first, but very quickly it could be sucked into the ocean, which is the world's biggest carbon sink. It could be sucked up into swamps, marshes, absorbed by trees, which of course need it to grow, and then turn it into oxygen. So there's this very complex cycle, and it's all probabilistic about where things go next. So there's some probability that the emissions that you generate are going to end up in the atmosphere. Some probability that they're going to do other things, and they're going to start working their way back through the carbon cycle to eventually become fossil fuels again in millions and millions and millions of years. But the little bit that ends up in the atmosphere, now we have to ask, so is that a harm? Well, definitely not a harm so far. It's molecules in the atmosphere. That's not a harm. So what is the harm? Well, you might think, well, it's the global warming associated with molecules in the atmosphere. So one, your little bit of molecules in the atmosphere in a system so big is not going to increase the temperature of the planet. But even if you thought about it as, an infinitesimal, like a million decimal points or whatever, I'm making that up, this is not math, but some number with at the end of many, many decimal points, slight increase in temperature or something like that, that's actually still not the harm. The harms of climate change are not a very slight increase in global average temperature. The harms of climate change are things like heat waves, droughts, famine, hurricanes, mudslides, right? And these are related probabilistically to the global average temperature rise, right? So we're now like multiple steps away from your very, very tiny contribution. Basically, the idea is a bunch of people have thought that the atmosphere and the harms of climate change are like a bathtub you're filling up with water. And so we're kind of told everything you do matters. Yes, the atmosphere is really big, but if you're adding drops of water to a bathtub that's overflowing, eventually your drop of water is going to push some water out over the edge, and that's the harms of climate change. But that's just not how any of this works. It's not how the climate works. It's not what the harms of climate change are. So you're adding something that's more like a drop to an ocean, not a drop to a bathtub. And it's not actually causing a particular harm that overruns. Instead, it is doing this incredibly tiny thing at changing a massive system, which is then related probabilistically to a change in the planetary system, which is also related probabilistically to discrete harmful events. That's an updating of the Senate Armstrong argument. And he basically says the result is there's no meaningful sense that your actions contribute to harm. You're doing something else. You're doing this tiny little thing that's together with 8 billion other people causing harm, but your individual action by itself is not meaningfully causing or contributing to harm. Okay, so if you want to push back against that, you're not alone. Philosophers have made an entire cottage industry out of this, and we can talk about it. But for now, we're going to leave it there. The system is too big and too complex. It's insensitive to your individual choice. What I want to do then, and one of the things that I take my book as sort of providing a contribution is, this has largely been talked about in isolated cases. So the climate folks talk about this as if climate is special, but it has shown up in different literatures before. And I think what's really important is to recognize that there are lots of things that we do that have this structure. Animal ethics has had this conversation for a very long time. So philosophers Shelley Kagan, Alistair Norcross, a group of folks were writing about this 20 and 30 years ago, saying, oh yeah, it feels like it don't make a difference when I buy a little chicken from the market. And then some of them were trying to say, oh, but the system can be affected by your individual purchase. They were having early versions of this conversation. But folks probably in this room, some folks, yeah, at least a few who work on animal agricultural systems can imagine it may not be as big and as complex as the planetary system, but it's really big and really complex, right? So a group of us at Berman have worked with modelers in Australia to talk about sort of what it would take to actually enact a shift that would have a sort of meaningful impact on the supplying of animal products. And one, the numbers are huge. You know, we had to hypothesize pure fantasy that we could get 10% of Americans to go from beef, this very environmentally intensive thing, all the way to plant-based replacements, when in fact, most people who move away from beef replace it with chicken or pork or something like that. But you have to do these really big numbers that entail things like 30 or 40 million people making changes to start to see an effect. And even then, the effects are pretty small. And a very quick supply and demand lesson shows us why. So when we started working with these modelers who are economic systems modelers, one of the things they said that was really distressing to us, the ethicists who wanted to be like, we can band together and change the food system, is if you were able to start having an effect by like getting enough people to stop eating meat, the first impact would not be that fewer animals were tortured and slaughtered. The immediate impact was that the price would drop, demand elsewhere would go up, and we would start shipping it overseas. And now you have the same number of animals being killed, and we have to pay for shipping it and all of that. So the environmental costs can actually go up in these scenarios. So that doesn't mean that we cannot have any impact at all as collectives. It means that the collectives have to be really big and well organized, which is why this is a problem in game theory. Okay, so animals have provided a version of this. I love this title and subtitle from the New York Times. How to be a more conscious consumer, even if you're on a budget. Here's the subtitle, or the headline. Most of us financially support companies we might not necessarily support socially, ethically, or philosophically. And so this is a long, New York Times style investigation of what are the things that what are your purchases supporting in the world? And there's a bunch of horror shows, right? It's a bunch of sweatshop labor, slave labor, child labor. It's a bunch of exploitation and union busting, right? So there's this idea in consumer ethics that you're supposed to vote with your dollars, boycott bad companies, right? I'm gonna point a finger at myself. I needed something warm while I was talking. So as one of my students likes to remind me, participating in union busting, right? And probably lots of other bad things. Who knows? I don't know the story about where the coffee beans come from and how the farmers are treated, for instance. It would take a huge amount to know everything that you need to know. And so in a lot of our choices in the consumer market, we're supporting things that we may not want to support, or at least that we shouldn't want to support. We can get a really graphic version of this, a really acute, hard to turn away from version. So this is the US lithium ion battery market. So this is the stuff that powers all of our phones and computers, also my shiny electric car that I feel so good about. But here's the thing. Somewhere in the 70 to 80% range of all of the cobalt that we need to power a bunch of these rechargeable lithium ion batteries comes from places like this. So this is an open pit mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The journalist Siddharth Kara really kind of cracked open the story to public attention in the book cobalt red, how the blood of the Congo is powering our lives. And he's got a lot of pictures that he took on the ground at some significant risk. There's some pretty harrowing stories about what is done to keep people away from this sort of place. But these are open pit mines, incredibly dangerous conditions. They pay an average of something like $1 a day to what are so-called artisanal miners. And the case that Kara makes over the course of this book is because of the lack of options and because of the need of the immediately surrounding communities, that $1 a day wage is basically non-turned downable. And so this is equivalent to modern day slavery. That's Kara's punchline. And if that's true, then I'm going to go out on a limb here and say every single person in this room is supporting modern day slavery. Because we all have this, right? Multiple times. And then some of us even replace it like every 2 years. This should get you a little bit uncomfortable with navigating the sort of purity idea. Because maybe some of you are thinking, no, you really shouldn't joy guzzle, as if, because that's easy for us. None of us own a Hummer, I assume. Like, oh yeah, that person's doing a wrong thing because they're making their infinitesimal contribution to this massive problem, and it's dumb. But we are all making infinitesimal contributions to massive structural harms. And I don't think there's any way out of it with individual action. That's going to be part of the punchline. Okay, so we've got a big problem. We've got a puzzle which says, I am really fun at parties. Deborah was right. This is exactly how every gathering with me goes. Be forewarned. Okay, so why does someone like Walter Stanton Armstrong, who's an incredible philosopher, think that philosophy can't solve this problem? Because he said that he thinks that you have a duty not to joy guzzle, pre-theoretically. His intuition is that you have a duty not to joy guzzle. Why can't he make that work? I do a lot of the moral theory teaching relevant to people in this room, so I'm only shooting myself in the foot. But if there's anyone else who's like a moral theorist in this room, forgive the violence I'm about to do as I teach 3,000 years of moral philosophy in like 90 seconds. Okay, here is the cartoon of how moral action in the world looks. You have an agent, an action, and the consequences as a result of that action. Here's the secret that as someone who teaches moral philosophy for a living, I feel totally comfortable sharing with the world. The vast majority of all of the moral theories out there are identifying one of these aspects and really weighting down on them. And the rest of them are talking about multiple of these aspects and trying to figure out how you weigh them against one another. So consequentialism, which is the umbrella that employs utilitarianism. So if you've heard that fancy language, do the most good for the most people, that's saying consequences are all that matter. And that's how you can get something like, it's permissible to torture for good consequences, right? Because the action in itself doesn't matter. There's nothing that's inherently wrong. It's all about consequences. And also, you can be an absolute jerk and do everything for the wrong reasons. But if you bring about good consequences, you're doing the right thing, right? So that is basically the sort of overview of how moral philosophers tend to start pulling out these pieces. So now, what moral theories could tell us that there's something strictly wrong with joy guzzling or buying a new iPhone, right? The most obvious one is we should be able to point to some harm in the world, because what is it that makes us think this is wrong? Climate change causes harm, and modern day slavery in the Congo is causing harm. And so if they're causing harm collectively, we should be able to locate the harm in our actions. But the whole puzzle that I just described is precisely saying that doesn't work. Your individual action doesn't meaningfully cause or contribute to the harm. You're doing something else for sure. You're aligning yourself, and a bunch of you are probably already thinking you're aligning yourself. You're, thinking about, what you're willing to support, et cetera. But the consequences aren't going to give us an explanation. So when I first posed the puzzle to philosophers who haven't thought about it before, many of them immediately say, well, this isn't too puzzling for me because I'm not a consequentialist, right? So I don't actually think that you have to find something wrong. You have to find some harm as a result of the action in order to show why it's wrong. Some actions are just wrong because of the nature of the action, which is really the sort of central claim of non-consequentialist deontic theory. So umbrella here, deontology. So certain actions are to be done or not to be done. If you need to get your deontological juices going, think about keeping a promise, right? You've made a promise to somebody. Now, situation has changed, that person's not around, they're not here, and you're thinking, man, I could promote a lot more happiness if I break that promise. Here's what the deontologist is going to say. You have to keep your promise because it's in the nature of a promise to be kept. That's the whole point of the institution of promise making and promise keeping. It's so that we will do things no matter how we change in the future. It's tying yourself to the mast, right? So it is in the nature of a promise to be kept. So certain actions are just right and certain actions are just wrong. So good deontologists will say things like torture's wrong. The utilitarian got this one wrong. They said that sometimes you can torture if the consequences add up right enough. And the deontologist says, actually, you can't, right? Morally can't. It is morally impermissible to do things like torture because it's just a wrong in itself action. So the question for these cases is, why would it be wrong in itself to take a flight? Why would it be wrong in itself to use a computer to do your work, right? And the quick point is, it sure doesn't seem like any of these actions are wrong. As a matter of fact, a bunch of them feel like good actions. So I fly to Cyprus to be a good husband and a good dad and a good son-in-law, and that's where my family is. It's a lot to go to Cyprus every year. It's also pretty great, to be clear. But it feels like a good thing to travel to see one's family. And so it really doesn't seem like a good candidate action to be wrong in itself. Okay, so these are not actions that are wrong in themselves. They would be wrong if they cause harms and they don't cause harms. So then there is one camp of folks who say, well, that whole thing doesn't work because it's not a good way to think about ethics. The right way to think about ethics is to talk about character. A good person wouldn't joy guzzle. So my question is, why not? And that's actually Walter Sinnott Armstrong's question, but why wouldn't a good person joy guzzle? And if joy guzzling caused harm, we would be able to explain why a good person wouldn't joy guzzle, but it doesn't cause harm. And it's not wrong in itself. So what is it about joy guzzling that makes one not able to do it, or that would be a reflection of bad character? So I gave my very first book talk at my alma mater, Hanover College in Indiana, and a bunch of my old professors were in the room, which was really delightful. And one of them taught me virtue ethics. I did a bunch of Plato, Aristotle with him, spent many, many, many hours of my life at his farmhouse thinking about ancient philosophy. And he was in the front row. And I said, Don, maybe temperance is supposed to help us, right? His name's Don Carroll. That's why I said Don. Don, maybe temperance is supposed to help us, right? Like a temperate person is a virtuous person. Surely a temperate person wouldn't, I caught myself. It's not that a temperate person would enjoy guzzle, it's that a temperate person would enjoy guzzle too much, I guess. So I looked at Don and said, Don, how many joy guzzles does the virtuous person get? And without missing a beat, he said, 7. Which is a funny, absurd answer because it's not an answer, right? We can't actually generate the case that you have an obligation not to joy guzzle by talking about character. Okay, that was my great violence to the history of moral philosophy, but also kind of an updated summary of Sinnott Armstrong's argument. So here's my view. The view I lay out in the book is that Walter Sinnott Armstrong actually got this right. You cannot justify a strict duty not to do things like joy guzzle. What he didn't get right is sort of an omission. He doesn't weight heavily enough the idea that that's just not all of the important stuff in moral philosophy. So he does actually say, way back in this early article, something that no one highlights. He's like, look, that doesn't mean you don't have reasons not to do this stuff. It just means you're not wrong if you do it. And no one talks about that because they wanted to make it wrong. So I want to really lean into this distinction between wrong and reasons. So my diagnosis here is that we are obsessed with duty and obligation. Now, some of that we as philosophers are obsessed with duty and obligation, which is why everyone responding to Walter Sinnott Armstrong was like, I can show that you have a duty not to joy guzzle. But I actually think humans, even if they're not thinking in jargon, I think humans are largely obsessed with duty and obligation too. Because when something looks bad to us, we want to be able to say it's wrong. We want to be able to like stand in that moral authority to be like, don't do that. That's not the right thing to do. It's the sort of relationship that we give that's very empowering in morality. When somebody's a liar, we're like, stop lying. You're a liar. We should all stand up and judge you. So this leads to what I have reluctantly called my spectrum of shouldiness. And I got this from my good friend Kelly Hewer, who went to Georgetown with me and then went off into the corporate world. And she workshopped the book with me. And some of my philosopher friends were like not buying this whole reasons versus duty thing. And she's like, come on, be a human for a second. Stop trying to dissect it. Yes, everyone recognized there are degrees of shoulddiness. I was like, oh, Kelly, that is awful. True, but awful language. And I was like, well, degrees of audiness? Yeah, that is definitely not better. Okay, so I stuck with degrees of shoulddiness. And at one end of the spectrum here is duty and obligation. Duty and obligation is maximally shouldy, which is to say you must do things that you have a duty to do. You morally must do them. It's a moral requirement. This is the strongest language and concept that we have in our moral lexicon. But at the other hand, we have some pretty weak stuff, like reasons. You have moral reasons to do all sorts of things. So here's the story I chose in the book to sort of make it make sense that we have reasons to do things that we don't have duties to do. So my daughter, Sinem, who some of you know, she was on campus last week. So Sinem and I were driving home, and there's a very busy road in Howard County, 108, that's right outside our neighborhood. So we were about to turn off 108 in our neighborhood. It's a very busy road. People go at 55 miles an hour on this road. And right ahead of where we were turning into our neighborhood, there was a turtle very slowly crossing the road. Now, my daughter and I love turtles. We're obsessed with turtles. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things Deborah knows about me. So Sinem immediately yells up in the background, Dad, you have to go save it. Daddy, you have to save the turtle. And what she recognized is what a human would recognize, which is that this turtle was gonna die. This turtle is not gonna make it across this road. So I pulled over in the neighborhood and I was thinking about like what I should actually do here. And here's what I believe. I believe that we do not have duties to rescue wild animals. If we did, they would be insanely demanding. There are trillions of wild animals suffering and dying right now. A lot of that suffering and dying is important for, the not suffering and dying of other trillions of animals. That's the ecosystem. I'm pretty sure none of us has a duty to rescue wild animals. But there were good reasons to rescue that turtle, right? Like, look, there's a reason anytime an animal's under threat, because if a car crushes it, it's gonna get squashed, it's gonna suffer and die. That suffering, that pain, that death is a reason to save it. Also, my daughter was very invested in the turtle at this time, and so I wanted to make her happy, moral reason. I think exhibiting compassion, modeling compassion for your kids, compassion for animals and other sentient beings is valuable. Good reason. Running out in the middle of a busy road, maybe not the best reason, so there's a little bit of waiting to be done here. But eventually I'm like, yes, okay, I have good reason to save this turtle. I did it. Human transport and turtle made it safely out of the road. I carried it like way far into the tall grass on the other side and pointed it in the other direction, and it probably went back in the road the next day. But the point here is that it's perfectly sensible to understand that some actions are morally valuable. They're good. They are justifiable. They're easily explainable in terms of their goodness, even if they're not required. So the fancy language for this sort of view is deontic pluralism. Deontic here just means the realm of action. So there is more in our morality of action than just duty. So that would be monism, right? If it's just duty. A lot of philosophers are implicit monists. So I'm a deontic pluralist. I think the world is full of really rich stuff, character and reasons and goodness and badness and value and duty, right? So if you have a pluralistic view, you can separate out reasons and duty. And on the duty side, you say these are strict moral requirements. That means they are closely related to praise and blame. They're not uniformly related, which is to say sometimes we have interesting cases. They're interesting because they deviate from the norm, but cases where you do something wrong but shouldn't be blamed. So we have interesting cases of blameless wrongdoing, like if the circumstances were so severe that it would have taken sort of superhuman will to do the right thing. Then we can be like, look, you did the wrong thing, but we're gonna hold you blameless. We don't think you should be punished. We shouldn't hold you accountable. The moral community shouldn't shun you, right? But for the most part, we tend to think if you act wrongly, you should be blamed. And if you act well very often, especially if you act well in the face of obstacles, that's when you should be praised. There's a tight connection here, even though it's not a uniform one. Also, duties often correlate with rights. So philosophers are really clever about naming things. So this is called the correlativity thesis. But the idea here is that very often if I have a directed duty to Deborah, she has a right against me that I perform that duty, right? So one of the reasons that duties are like really high stakes game is because very often they imply rights, and we think rights are entitlement, that somebody owes this to you, right? This is one of the reasons that things like, do you have a right to food and housing, a moral right, not a political one? Really high stakes, because if you do, then somebody, presumably society or something like this, owes it to you. as a matter of duty or obligation. And so the philosopher Stephen Darwall says this grounds a standing to demand. And I really like this language because if I have a duty, then not only the person to whom I owe that duty, but also the moral community has a standing to demand that I fulfill my duty. This is a sort of, when I have a duty, I don't have rights of against sort of privacy rights. That's not quite the right language. The philosophers don't get hooked up on it. But there's an invasion that's licensed when I have a duty, because now you have the standing to demand that I fulfill my duty. Duty's heavy stuff. Obligation is heavy stuff, right? Reasons are none of these things. Reasons are considerations that count in favor of something. This is actual jargon. This is a definition that a lot of philosophers are on board with, sort of modern analytic moral philosophers. So the idea here is just that anytime something counts in favor of something, you have a reason to do that thing. And this makes sense of actions being better or worse. So the suffering that would have resulted to the turtle if it got squashed gave me a reason to rush out into the road and to carry it to safety, right? So one of the things when we make sense of actions being better or worse is we can talk about what's sometimes called the sub-erogatory. That's new language probably to some of you. We're sometimes here supererogatory. So supererogatory actions are ones that go above and beyond the call of duty. Sub-erogatory actions are ones that are well below the call of duty. They're good. They're justifiable. They're justified. There's something to recommend them, right? But they're not required by duty. And so this language is really important to me. They can commend or justify without requiring. That's the stuff that reasons can do that's really important. And so preview, what I want to do is I want to say in a world where we're facing all of these ways of being implicated in massive harms and injustice, it would be hard and paralyzing and difficult, as the philosophers have shown, to justify the idea that you have a duty not to do any of it. You couldn't live up to it. It would take your whole life. But there are reasons, and those reasons commend or justify actions. So I will keep saying that to help make it make sense. So reasons are everywhere, and that's because reasons come cheap. The only thing that you need to have a reason is value. Something has to count in favor of something. And every time that's true, you have a reason to do something. This sounds technical and jargony because I'm talking like a philosopher, but I don't think this is at odds with anybody's intuition. Stuff in the world, when it's good, it counts in favor of you doing it. Thing is, when reasons come cheap, you have so many of them. So this guy, it's Mark Schroeder, he's out in California, really, really just brilliant philosopher, loves to talk about reasons, even more than I do, if you can imagine that. And he says in one of his books that you have a reason to eat your car. And of course, you shouldn't eat your car. His point is to show how cheaply reasons come. And his explanation of why you have a reason to eat your car is that doing so would provide you with like the daily recommended allowance of iron or something like that. It's probably not true. I don't think cars are ever made of iron anymore, but you see this, the premise of the joke, right? And so nobody should actually consider whether or not they should eat their car, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to recommend it, right? So like right now, should you stand up and do jumping jacks in the room? Probably not. It's not probably all things recommended, whoops. But like there are obvious reasons to stand up and do jumping jacks. It's good for you, right? Like gets your blood flowing, wakes you up. You have to listen to this guy for an hour, Jesus. So all sorts of reasons to stand up and do jumping jacks. All right. What that means is the normative world is an absolute mess. Like we're just assaulted by reasons because there's value and disvalue everywhere. And so this is the question I ultimately wanted to get to in my book. So why did I write a 300-page book instead of just keep writing 20-page articles? It's because I wanted to have the space to say enough that I could finally get to the point that if you buy all this, that the world is just full of normative stuff, and some of it's not all that weighty, but it's real, how do you organize it? This takes us to the final part of the talk. Okay. I think what this means is that we need rules. I can give you an argument for this. It's in the book, but I also think it's just pretty intuitive. When you're faced with all of these reasons, you need some way of organizing them. And so I think we need rules, but the rules are not duties. Sometimes in bioethics, especially, we think rules, we think principles, and those generate duties, right? Do no harm. That rule generates a duty not to, I don't know, stab your patient or something. Sorry, that was not a very good example. I mean, sometimes you do have to stab your patient. Viv probably stabs her patients all the time, but like for good reasons. These rules are not duty generating. They're organizing heuristics. So they're giving us a set it and forget it ability to start to navigate this world, right? So I think we're pretty familiar with using heuristics. Some people think that they have strict duties when it comes to their food, but I've been talking to people about food ethics for a very long time. And what I actually think is I think a lot of people have heuristics about their food. And I think this because they have all sorts of carve outs. I ask ethicists, especially who are just like guilty consciences walking around. I'm like, are you vegetarian or vegan? And a lot very common responses like, no, I probably should be. I eat, mostly produce and stuff, but I have carve outs where I'm traveling and etiquette and, what you have is a heuristic. You recognize the value of certain things, not everyone, right? But if you recognize the value of not participating in massive animal torture and slaughter, like, okay, there we go. You participate in you value the participation in trying to change norms so that we live more sustainably. And eating vegetables is just way more sustainable because otherwise we have to grow a bunch of vegetables and legumes and stuff that we then feed to animals to grow them for 6 months or 9 months so that we can then eat them. It's a hugely inefficient system, right? So we have all sorts of heuristics, and that leads to things like flexitarianism or pescatarianism. You have carve-outs, right? I think this general idea of a heuristic that helps us respond to value, but doesn't pretend to be generating a concrete strict duty is just a really helpful way to navigate our lives. So some of you saw way back when an early version of this. This is the version that actually ended up in my book. So Compliments of Penguin, I was able to cut this out and use it in publications and talks. But this 3x3, I'm going to walk you through it, and it's basically the end of the talk. So we're gonna figure out this 3x3, the matrix, and that's it. This is the way that I came up with to try to organize heuristics that respond to all of the reasons in the world, not all the reasons, a bunch of onslaught of reasons in the world, such that we can start to live our life and just not be paralyzed like Chidi all the time, right? So here, there are two different ways of organizing it. It's a 3x3. So one is by kind of reason. So I labeled these kinds of reasons: purity, social, and structural. I'll describe them. And then by how much normative competition the reasons face, or the heuristic organizing the reasons face. And so this is just one set of heuristics just for climate change. Remember I said we're facing all sorts of catastrophe, right? So these are heuristics that I came up with. And the first thing I wanted to note was, at the beginning of the talk, when I just wanted to get your intuitions going, I largely talked about purity-based reasons. This idea that we should be drawn to withdraw ourselves from harmful systems. But now we can use some philosophy language. That's a negative reason. It's a reason not to do something, right? It's a reason to avoid participating in or contributing to some system, structure, or collective. But climate change doesn't just give us negative reasons. It gives us positive reasons to do things in response. And there's a whole section of the book that I couldn't talk about here because I needed it to be somewhat held together in 45 minutes. But a lot of people hate the focus on purity ethics in this conversation. And so Marianne Hegler, as fantastic activist, climate activist, wrote an essay that I talk about all the time because the title is good enough, you get it. Her title is, "I work in the climate movement, I don't care if you recycle." And her whole thing was like, forget your freaking purity. You're not making a difference. You're raking leaves on a windy day, is what she says. I want you in the climate fight, man. I want you doing the work, marching in the streets, lobbying, giving your time and money, right? Now, here's where I think she's not necessarily any more right than my friends who are really obsessed with purity. I think being obsessed with purity at the expense of this is not particularly justifiable. It's one choice among many. And I think Hegler, if she really believes it, that doing this is what's really important, is also not super justified, because this stuff is just as real, right? Participating in supporting slave labor is bad. There is genuine reason not to do it. So one of the things that people like Hegler say is, well, yeah, but you can be more impactful down here. Show me the data. A lot of times you can't. A lot of times you can contribute your measly $100 or $1,000 or whatever's in your means to a pile of funds that's going to be $20 billion over the next 10 years to try to attack a problem that nobody in the history of humanity has been able to solve yet. Or you might phone bank for a candidate, and you're one phone banker of how many? And you get 3 people over the course of an 8-hour shift to actually pick up and talk to you, and they all hate you, right? I'm being gross and pessimistic, but you get the idea. There might be a sense in which some of the things that you can do to join the fight are more impactful than some of the things you can do to withdraw. But I think it's real close to a moral wash. I think it's much more like, what do people prefer to do? And some people find this really hard because they really like doing stuff. They really like going on vacations, or they have family overseas and stuff like that. And then some people find this stuff really, really hard. And they're pretty comfortable kind of withdrawing from society, but they don't want to talk or engage with other people, and they hate politics and trying to change structures. It's just not their thing. Here is one of my punchlines. I don't think there's any justification that one of those is better than the other. I think they're all more akin to lifestyle choices than a response to moral demands. And so what I want is I want people to think through all of the different ways that catastrophes give us reasons. What? I don't think I did that. We'll see. And start to think about what they can do. And I'm going to give just a few pieces of advice on that. Okay, so we have the different kinds of reasons. And then I think it's also really important to recognize that some of them face virtually no opposition. I tell my daughter 1,000,000 times a day not to be wasteful, because there is genuinely no reason to oppose this heuristic. Being wasteful is basically inherently unreasonable, right? Like, it's built into the nature of waste that it's not good for anything. And so, like, turn off lights when she leaves the room. Will that solve climate change? Of course not. It will not register. It's not even a drop in the bathtub. It's not even a drop in the ocean, blah, blah, blah. Also, turn off the damn lights, right? And they're just so easy. They don't face any opposition. And so basically, anytime somebody offers me a heuristic that I haven't thought about that falls in this column, I adopt it. Why not? It's built into it that you don't have any reason not to adopt it. But then stuff gets hard. Because over here, there are genuine competing reasons, and they do not have to be high-minded. If you really, really like meat, it doesn't have to be because it's so important to your culture. It could just be because that's what you like, and food is like a big part of the good life for a whole bunch of people. Like, food is something that we love. And so if it's a real cost to you to give up meat entirely, well, start to think about whether you can decrease your consumption a little bit. This isn't about purity. This isn't about strict duties. It's about recognizing a value and moving towards it. But the considerations that face it are real, even if they're not overwhelming. And then there's stuff over here that faces compelling competing reasons, right? So minimizing your carbon footprint is almost impossible because we live in an extractive society, right? So you can work and work and work, and you will never fully satisfy this heuristic. Be a loud advocate for climate change. It can take your whole life. That can be your career, your calling, and your passion. Volunteer for the movement, same thing. So the difference between these is supposed to be more about like personal engagement versus advocating for structural change, even if it's not about interacting with others. So that's the social structural distinction. All right, so to point the finger at myself rather than everyone else, here is the 3x3 colored in for me. So I came up with these heuristics. The darker the gray, the better I live up to them. If it's in this column, I basically live up to it. Like, why wouldn't you? And if I walk out of the house and I left the lights on, and then we drive back home at night and the lights are burning and it was me and not my kid for once that left them on, you better believe my daughter will be like, "Daddy, dead dinosaurs," which is what we say in our house to like tell somebody to turn lights off. To be clear, I know that fossil fuels are not literally dead dinosaurs, and I told her that, but it's a funny way to talk about it. Okay. So this gets pretty well colored in. As soon as you move over here, there are genuine competing reasons. I start to do less well, right? I was flying recently, and I'm stuck in an airport for a long time. And the only thing that I can find in this very crappy airport is that's healthy and doesn't look disgusting is a turkey sandwich. And you better believe I ate that turkey sandwich. I don't prefer turkey sandwiches. I don't go out and buy them to have in my house because I'd rather eat a black bean burrito or something that is respecting my heuristic to eat low in the food chain. But I did not think twice about eating a turkey sandwich when it was the only non-disgusting healthy food option that I could find. So these face modest competing reasons, and I don't do very well at all at minimizing my carbon footprint because I just told you where my in-laws live, right? I also commute because Saudi works the northwest side of DC. So we split the difference and live in Columbia. You get the idea, right? So why is the middle row the darkest for me? This is the real lesson I want to draw out. It's because it's where my interests, my passion, my skills, and my privilege give me real opportunity. I'm a professor, a speaker, and an author. I get to engage with people for a living, and I love doing it. And I think I'm okay at it. You guys may disagree, that's fine. But I think I'm as good at it as anything else, right? And so this is always going to be where I place most of my effort. And down here, I have a 10-year-old and a demanding job. And I would love to do this someday, but that day is not today. This is volunteer for the movement, if you can't see, right? So being a volunteer takes up a lot of time, and it's not something I have a lot to do. The general lesson here is because I think this is more like a lifestyle choice than like a response to moral demands, I think we have latitude. You have moral latitude to decide how to arrange your life. And the only real restriction on this is that they're all real reasons. And so you really should do something. And we should constantly feel the moral pressure pushing us towards that side. You're never going to be able to live up to it all, because if you spent your whole life doing this, it would wipe out your ability to do everything else. It would take all of your time, your energy, and your money, right? And that has real opportunity cost. You would no longer be a champion for anything else. And I know some people like that. We can talk about the sort of choice between lives if you want. But that's the basic lesson. You pick a life, and you pick a life for reasons, and those reasons are highly subjective. So brief upshot of the lessons. There's no single thing that I think you must do, but you could always do more, and it would be good if you did. And this is one of the hard things about catastrophe ethics. If there was a duty to just not joy guzzle, you'd be like, not joy guzzling, done my job. But no, we got reasons everywhere, so the work is never done. And that can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming because you could always dark out, gray out more of that matrix. But it's a rebuttal to nihilism. This is the project of the whole book. If a purity ethic is unreasonable, are we immediately driven to nihilism? And I think I've just shown that we're not, because there is meaningful, justifiable living to be done that is neither purist nor nihilist. So yeah, everything you do matters, but you get to matter. How cool is that? This is the closest thing you get to optimistic Travis. So moral life in the 21st century is actually creative, because you have to decide this life for yourself. That's your existentialist lesson for the day. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
All right. Yeah. What?
Thanks, Travis. That was fascinating. But I want to go back to the question of duty to do what you call the political type things.
Yeah.
And say you can't do everything, but you have a duty to do something. And it doesn't matter, frankly, under this theory, whether you will actually achieve it. If you're trying to change gun laws, you don't know if it's going to make a difference. It may have no effect, but there's some level of obligation. And your talk reminded me of the famous statement in Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of the fathers in Jewish teaching, which is you are not required to finish the task, yet neither are you permitted to desist from it. That is a moral statement. And I'm wondering how you think that idea fits into the kind of prudent, discretionary, subjective approach to taking action to try to improve the world in some way, not in every way, not you do climate change and guns and whatever, but you do something. How do you address that argument?
Yeah, such a good question. So I'll do it quickly in case other people want to get in before the end of our time. So you said, I think there's some level of duty. I mean, I think your language of some level is great for my spectrum of shouldiness. And I would just change it to, well, you don't have some level of duty, you have some level of responsibility. And so you have some level of responsibility to do that, but also many other things. So you could focus on guns and let other people worry about the mines in the Congo, right? Here's the thing that there's a bullet that I bite that doesn't taste sour to me. That was a way to mix metaphors. Okay, So I think I am compelled to admit that you don't violate any duty if you don't work towards any of these collective solutions. But here's the thing. Remember when I talked about reasons are real? And so the fact that we need to respond to them really matters, even though they're not duties. So blame doesn't entirely only go with duty. Sometimes we blame people just because they're like crappy people, right? And here's one of the things that I think we start to recognize when somebody doesn't give any effort to anything. They're just kind of a crappy person. And we don't want to be friends with them, and we don't want to share our world with them. And they're not part of our moral community. And that cost is what I think we have instead of, I don't think we have that blunt tool where we can say, you are morally required to pick something and do the work. But I think we can say, if you're a decent human at all, you're going to pick something because the reasons are overwhelming and you need to build a life. And so that's as far as I think I can go in terms of like articulating the normative basis. But I think it's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks, Travis. I actually wanted to pick up on something that you just mentioned at the end of your response to Len, which is praise, blame, being under duty. And it's not that I object to it being under duty, but I'm surprised it's not under reasons. And
yeah,
I mean, we can think of moving the turtle. I have a very, very dear friend who altruistically donated a kidney 2 months ago.
Yeah.
Okay, praise, not a duty. And you bring your friend a meal after they get out of the hospital. So I think that, anyway, I'm just surprised to see it only in one column.
Yeah. So that's great. Actually, I should actually just put it in both columns to avoid this confusion. So exactly my response to Lan, I don't think it's only in the praise and only in the duty column. It's there because it was listed there because that's where it tends to be sort of most uniformly thought of, right? You are blamed when you do wrong actions. But what you're pointing out is that because reasons give us subrogatory recommendations, they're below the call of demand. When somebody responds to them anyway, we actually tend to praise them for that. So I think we tend to blame people most often when they violate duty, although my response to Lynn shows that we can actually hold people blameworthy for just being crappy people and never engaging at all. But that's a sort of non-standard case. But I think praise very often goes with responding to the subrogatory, which are reasons. That's a great point. And I will change my slides because I want to avoid that. Yeah. Graham.
Yes. Get it.
Yeah, I'm more
So it seems like the majority of what you spoke about are collective action problems. And their overlap with catastrophe, but it strikes me that there are a lot of other kinds of catastrophes that are maybe not collective action problems, like comets slamming into the earth or something along those lines. I'm curious if there are other, one, does the book address other forms of ethics that apply to catastrophes beyond collective action problems? Is there an ethics that can be I don't know. Yeah. Why isn't the book titled Collective Action Ethics?
Way less sexy, mostly. I remember this is a trade book. We want people to read it. No, okay, so yes and no. By and large, I am not concerned with catastrophes that don't have this structure. So despite the title coming up front and you haven't read anything, I define catastrophe ethics as dealing with the cases where uncoordinated, unintentional action of millions or billions of people result in harms or injustices that we don't actually want, right? So the reason it's still a little bit yes is because if a comet is going to slam into the earth, we're going to generate a bunch of catastrophe ethics response questions. So now we need to know, I have a piece I'm going to publish on the Hastings Center Forum on charitable giving. And so the interesting part about charitable giving is that it's a very old ethics conversation, but it gets raised here, right? It's a positive response to the fact of harm and suffering. And so one of the things that you have to do is you have to trade off. You don't have infinite funds, and there are all sorts of places that need your financial resources. And so you have to trade off what you're supporting. So if a comet's going to slam into the earth, there are going to be a bunch of questions about how do we support it socially? How do we support it with our money, right? As soon as we know it's going to happen or in the aftermath, we're going to have these collective action problems arise. So my general view is that catastrophe tends to generate a bunch of catastrophe ethics, but I'm also sort of uniquely interested in the case like climate change, where nobody wants this, right? The fossil fuel companies arguably aren't too mad about it happening, like not mad enough to do anything about it, but it's not like they want it to happen. It would be far better if they never had to change their ways. So that's the paradigm case. Yeah.
The other bit related to it, it's Mike, but so like some forms of catastrophe are like very low probability events, but the outcome is so unbelievably bad that like you wind up with some sort of like expected value moral calculation, like don't do things that might lead to that, even though the odds are very low, which feels different than a lot of the other examples that you're giving here, where it's like, this is a really high probability event that this is going to happen, but it's very hard to organize people around it. And I wonder if there's any, I don't know, difference to explore around different categories of catastrophe there or something.
My guess is that most of what does the interesting work is going to be a different set of tools than what I described. But what immediately comes to mind is this is not like such a low probability, but I talk a little bit about nuclear energy since the book deals a lot with climate change, right? And so to transition significantly to nuclear energy, which by the way is required to avoid real catastrophe and climate change, all of our models just assume we're going to build a bunch of new nuclear power plants. And a bunch of environmentalists who are worried about climate change are also very worried about the fact that we are now going to pursue nuclear power because we have these low probability, high cost events that things like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island warn us about, right? So here's a thing that fits the model perfectly. Should you spend your organizing effort out trying to fight the use of nuclear power to decarbonize our economy, right? And so that deals with that low probability, high cost event, but still within the realm of like, where should you spend your limited resources to fight massive threats that you're not in control of? Two great questions. I had never thought about this before. Yeah, out of time.
We are at the top of the hour, so thank you very
Thanks, y'all. Thank you.